All right, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. We can start our webinar. I want to welcome you to Americans for Peace Now's webinar with Lara Friedman and Danny Seidemann. This is another briefing call, another briefing that we're having, and I just want to make sure that I'm recording it. So yes, we are recording. We're good. And as I said, this is another briefing in a series that we've been having for the past several weeks on the issue of West Bank annexation. Just like we did in previous briefings, this one too is being recorded. We will post the recording on our website and render from it an episode of Peacecast, our podcast, APN's podcast. We would love to receive questions from you. You can start asking questions right now if you'd like using the Q&A tool. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. You click on it, you write your question, and I will see it and relay it to our panelists. And please do not use the chat tool. If you know APN, then you know Lara and you know Danny, but still I'm going to introduce them. Lara Friedman, my dear friend and former colleague, is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She joined FMEP in 2017 after a long career at APN as its Director of Policy and Government Relations. Lara is really a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, particular expertise on Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli-Arab conflict, settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of Congress in U.S. policy on the Middle East. Welcome, Lara. Thanks for joining us. You're
Great to
muted.
be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. And Daniel Seidemann, Danny, is my friend and a longtime friend of APN. He is an Israeli attorney who specializes in Israeli-Palestinian relations with an emphasis on Jerusalem. He's the founder and director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an NGO that works toward a resolution of the question of Jerusalem that is consistent with the two-state solution. Danny, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you.
I'd like to start, if that's okay with you, with basically two questions to sort of frame our discussion. Yesterday was July 1st. It's the due date, if you will, that Prime Minister Netanyahu set for his government to start the process that would lead to West Bank annexation. Nothing much happened, but still, it doesn't mean that he's not going to push through with annexation. Netanyahu's stated intention at some point during this process was to annex the entire Jordan Valley and all Israeli settlements in the West Bank. It's about 30% of the West Bank. As I said, he did not make any statement yesterday, so we're interested to know. We really don't know exactly why that was, but what seems to be the case is that both the scope of annexation and the date in which this process will start have been sort of pushed back. So the two questions that I'll ask you is that due to opposition to annexation, to the annexation initiative? And if opposition in fact helped push back the scale and scale down annexation, is it also capable of rolling it back altogether? So maybe you start, Danny?
What do you mean by rolling it back, Ori?
Rolling it back in terms of time, just the fact that nothing happened yesterday, and it seems we've heard yesterday. By the way, I don't know if you heard that from Akunis, minister in the government, who said that it will happen, but it'll probably take a couple of weeks, and what the Israeli government is waiting for is some kind of a statement coming from President Trump.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let me preface my remarks by saying it's great to have the three of us back together. We have worked together in various capacities for many years, and so this is a bit of a class reunion, and it's a delight to see you, Lara, and you, Ori. let me begin by something that may be counterintuitive and almost a bit outrageous. Public opinion in Israel doesn't matter very much. I think that Netanyahu's calculus is very different. I'm not a great expert on Israeli public opinion. I will always defer to Danya Schindler, who does this better than anybody. But my impression is that support and opposition to annexation fluctuates. Currently, there's a tendency for something of a majority opposing it. It doesn't matter. I think more than anything else is a consistent result of polling. Most Israelis don't think that this is a high priority. It's not important. It's getting attention, but we are consumed by the pandemic and the economic crisis, and this is not consuming a lot of the country's oxygen. I also believe that Netanyahu will not make his decision based on the polling. He has other decisions. It may be his coalition, certainly President Trump, but only obliquely Israeli public opinion. And now I will qualify what I've just said to you. There is an oblique influence. One of the things that will definitely influence Netanyahu's decision is the position of Israel's security and intelligence community, who have not been consulted. The National Security Council has, but that's Netanyahu's kindergarten and backyard. And Israeli public opinion does have an impact on their willingness to engage Netanyahu and challenge him. I have to put in a really good word for Commanders for Israel Security. You know, I like a lot of what they do. I've been critical of them in the past. I think they're doing an amazing job. And their target audience isn't Israeli public opinion directly. It is, number one, the security community. And these are voices that cannot be ignored, and they're doing it well. They're also doing it publicly. And Gantz and Ashkenazi. Some of the guys in Commanders for Israel Security were the commanding officers of Gantz and Ashkenazi. They can't ignore them, although I rely on their ability to be spineless and to do the wrong thing. I mean, they may surprise us and weigh in correctly. There have been rumblings in that direction. But I certainly would not bet on it. So what does govern Netanyahu's consideration? Well, clearly it is arriving at some sort of understanding with the Trump administration, which is apparently not speaking in one voice. But more than that, it is controlling the discourse. Netanyahu is acting as if he's in trouble. With his legal problems, and my guess is that there's more coming. And there is nobody more masterful than dominating the discourse and shaping the Netanyahu, and annexation will be harnessed to that goal, to distract attention away from what is potentially a crumbling of his political credibility. Most of his attention on Israeli public opinion is not what they think now, but what they may think if he proceeds on annexation. And I would by no means be complacent. I think that the chances of some kind of annexation taking place are diminishing, but they have by no means gone away, and we are cautioned not to say that this is not over. One of the formative experiences in Netanyahu's political life is the Western Wall Tunnel incident. where he ignored the advice of the Israeli security authorities, opened a tunnel adjacent to the Temple Mount Haram Sharif Al-Aqsa, sparked the first round of organized violence between Israelis and Palestinians after the Oslo Accords, and he is associated with that. I mean,
That was in the late 90s, right?
That was 1996, October 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And he doesn't want a repeat of that. And Netanyahu is, in spite of all of this tsuris, he is vulnerable and he's imperial and she's a bit off the rails, something that you guys are familiar with, but he remains risk averse, which cannot be said to the same extent on your side of the Atlantic. He is very concerned about this causing an outbreak of violence and how Israeli public opinion will respond. And the engagement of the international community, which I think has been much better than I expected, whether it's the EU or Boris Johnson's op-ed yesterday in Yediot Ahronot, or the Vatican calling in both the US and Israeli ambassador today, that's getting through. And Netanyahu will be very reluctant to engage in something that could create a replication of the violence, not only because he's risk averse, but also because his public image at the moment is very fragile and it's being challenged, and he doesn't know what will make it disintegrate. So I think that that will impose a level of caution. And here, Israeli public opinion and the way the Democratic Party, the American Jewish community are engaging on this is highly significant in preparing Israeli public opinion. But it's oblique and it's not direct.
Okay. Thanks, Danny. Lara, if you'd like to go now, maybe for the same kind of duration of time, and talk a little bit about how you see it from here, from Washington. You should unmute though. Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
We're all getting better at this muting, unmuting thing. So, my starting point on this is, and I say this with no joy. Folks, from the day President Trump was elected until now, folks who have been given to produce analysis that gives you comfort that they won't do what they've said they were going to do have been proven wrong every single time. And I fear that the moment we're in, I was looking at headlines today, and there's a lot of headlines about, well, it didn't happen on July 1st, so clearly they've delayed it, they've postponed it, they've been pushed back. And I think to myself, if I were trying to understand what was happening, I do this. It's fine to read the learned analysis of pragmatic, rational foreign policy wonks in the US or writing in Haaretz. One would do well to spend a lot of time, though, reading Israel Hayom and reading Arutz Sheva, the settler media outlet, and reading Breitbart. And the analysis in those is not that, wow, July 1st came and went, and it's over. The analysis there is basically, there's a piece that's picked up in at least 3 places today by I think the editor of the Jewish News Syndicate, basically saying, great, now the clock is ticking. The window is now open and it closes potentially on November 3rd, or, I would say actually it closes at inauguration of the next president if it's not Trump. So they're not saying this is over. What they're saying is now we're in the period of intense, real negotiation between what the Trump administration may or may not want or may or may not allow Israel to do, and what the settlers demand, which goes potentially beyond that. And by the way, I am somewhat skeptical of that tension. I think that tension politically serves everybody. At the end of the day, there is a close ideological alignment between the folks in the Trump administration who are defining this administration's policy and the hardcore Greater Israel people. It's more a matter of style than of substance that they seem to disagree on. And I point out often to people when they say, well, they want, the question of you can only annex 30%. And I say, if you actually read the Trump plan, it's you can only annex 30% now. If the Palestinians fail to meet a laundry list of requirements that there's no possible way they will ever meet, it's designed for them not to meet, it basically says Israel can annex any of the rest that it wants. Let's be very clear. The Trump plan is a plan for annexation of the entire West Bank. And the fight internally in the Israeli political system over whether it leaves open a Palestinian state or not, and is really about substance rather than style, and about scoring political points in the Israeli domestic scene. And others may disagree with me. Others may see there's real substantive difference. The argument where settlers don't want a Trump plan that leaves open the hypothetical possibility of a Palestinian state that won't be a state except in a term that no one will ever accept, and the Palestinians would then even refuse to do what they need to get that state. It's surreal. July 1st came and went. It was not the date that annexation was supposed to happen. I tweeted yesterday that it's better to think about this as the opening of hunting season. You've now got your permit, and it says as of July 1st, you're allowed to go out and bag X number of deer. The fact that you did not bag any deer on day one does not mean that for the duration of hunting season, you are not going to try to bag your quota or even bag beyond your quota. That's where we are today. I'd also remind people of the Jerusalem embassy precedent for celebrating too soon. For those of us who warned that the Trump administration was serious about planning to move the embassy, I vividly remember the celebrations, or at least the "see, he's not that bad," that we got just after inauguration when he didn't move it, when it was clear that he came very close to deciding to move it and didn't announce it, but he didn't. They said, see, he's rational, he won't do it. And then when he used the waiver to force him to move it the first time, they said, see, he's rational, ignoring the statement he made with that waiver, which made absolutely clear it was a one-time thing and he was going to move it. So I think it makes a huge difference as we look at what will or won't happen. The analysis seems to, in many ways, be based on what people hope will or won't happen based on their understanding of Israel's national security interests and based on their understanding of how people rationally make policy, which unfortunately has not been what has driven US policy for the past 3.5 years. And at a moment where you have a bright green ideological green light, go for it, to Israel, it's very difficult to imagine that that there's going to be a significant break on the Israeli side. On the substance of it, and this is where I start to just sometimes tear out my hair. I was debating with someone the other day, said, well, but they've moved away now, at least for now, talking about the Jordan Valley. They're just talking about settlement blocks. So that is a concession, that's an improvement. And I don't understand the logic. The Jordan Valley is the most consensus thing that any prime minister could move ahead on annexation. From left to right, except for the real genuine left, everyone agrees. I mean, this is why Bibi started talking about that there. Who could disagree that we need to protect our border? Moving away from that to settlement blocks is basically pocketing Jordan Valley for later and going to something that would have been more controversial. I mean, it's baffling to me, the sort of analysis that, smart people engaging in analysis that is designed to make them feel better. It's not where this goes. On the US side, I mean, that's the Israel side. On the US side, look, the folks around President Trump, and people can debate, and I'm not close to anyone. I have no access in this administration at the higher levels, whether it's, whether it's Kushner or it's Friedman or it's Avi Berkowitz. The fact is, as an observer, I feel comfortable saying this is a David Friedman policy. And I take him seriously. I take him at his word, going back to his speech at APAC 2 years ago now, where he basically laid out the equivalent, speaking almost as a preacher. How would we look our children in the eye if we failed to meet all of our goals under this most pro-Israel, as he defines it, administration history. And since coming into office, they have systematically ticked off every one of the things they said they would do. The last thing on their list is annexation. They paved the way for annexation with a shift in policy on the Golan, where it is now official US policy that it is okay to obtain land if you did so in a defensive war, which lays the groundwork. Now, say, well, but there's much stronger international pushback. And that may be true. I don't think this administration gives even a tiny little bit of concern for international pushback. That doesn't, based on how they've behaved for the past 3.5 years, I don't see that as fitting into their analysis. Their focus appears to be, we have a set of voters we care about, we have a set of ideologies that we care about, we're gonna do what we want. Either you agree with us and you think it's great, or you don't agree with us and you're irrelevant and you're evil and you're stupid, and we'll do it, and the world will either embrace it or will at least accept it because they can't do anything to challenge it. And looking at, say, Europe, which absolutely has been stronger in its reaction, but Europe still won't articulate a single concrete sanction that Israel would face. So if I'm sitting in the White House and I say, well, someone says, well, if you do this, the Europeans, what are the Europeans going to do? They're going to issue more statements of concern. Europe isn't willing to even articulate a single concrete sanction. And they say, well, if you do this, it's going to be very problematic in terms of aid for Israel and Democrats. And I'm thinking, it was yesterday that the Senate is moving ahead now with an amended version of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the only piece of major legislation that will probably pass before our November elections. And they added to the base text with no discussion, no debate, they just added it in, this giant bill that codifies the MOU in an effort to make it impossible for anyone to play with aid to Israel. And it adds on millions of dollars and many levels of new cooperation with various agencies across the entire government. And they've added on into that same bill a new cooperation program that actually it gives Israel a seat at the table at the secretary level in basically, designing defense programs and deciding what we're going to move forward with in defense, cooperation. It's remarkable. So if I'm looking at this and they say, well, listen, if you do this, it's going to be bad for Israel because Congress won't play along because Democrats, I'd say, you may think so. All the evidence I see some letters, which are pretty, soft. The one letter that's stronger, don't worry about it. We're denouncing it as anti-Semitic. No one will pay attention. And I see Congress in a bipartisan way moving ahead with an unprecedented level of support for Israel and an unprecedented effort to actually legislate impunity and entitlement. So yeah, I'm not, I think I'm not, if someone wants to listen to me for like hope on how this is going to get turned back, I think hope would be deeply misplaced. And I'll add on here in terms of the timing, and I have no way to prove any of this. For folks who are thinking this is going to happen on July 1st or on or about July 1st, I think it's worthwhile thinking about what the Trump administration's calendar is. We're all thinking a lot about what Bibi's calendar is. For the Trump administration, annexation on July 1st is not particularly valuable. They need this to be seen as a Trump plan deliverable and a Trump achievement for Israel that they can deliver to their base. And having it happen strictly on a Gantz-Bibi timetable isn't helpful to them anyway. I think we're going to see machinations here which are designed from the US side at least to make sure that we can say, this is our gift. We gave you Jerusalem. We consecrated for you the Golan, and we're giving you this future. And we want a plaque, and we want you to name a park after us. Another park. I'll stop there.
Okay, so I have follow-up questions for both of you, and then we'll start taking questions from our attendees. The question that I'd like to ask you, Lara, is I agree with all your analysis, but I do see quite a bit of cracks in this wall that you have described. One thing that I think is quite significant is yesterday Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's quite, has always been quite supportive of Israel and so on, talked very favorably about use restrictions. Is that something that you think is, is a cause for optimism. And I'll go ahead and ask Danny my follow up, and then you can decide how you want to go about answering it. Um, Lara said, and I think rightly so, that the Trump administration is not at all worried about the view of the international community. How about Israel? Does Israel listen to what it is being said by so many leaders around the world? And another source of uh, pressure that we've seen on the Israeli government has been civil society. You of course mentioned the security establishment, which is quite a plays quite an important role. But how about civil society in Israel? Does the role of civil society organizations that have been quite vociferous in their opposition to annexation, does that play any kind of role?
Lara, go ahead.
I can be very quick. So looking at Congressman Van Hollen's comments yesterday, I read them, and he was very cogent as always and thoughtful, and I have to say that I think whether or not statements about use restrictions mean anything at all will depend on whether or not those use restrictions are connected to either cuts or holdback of funding. A lot of people talk about the loan guarantees as a precedent for use restrictions, right? So this is back in the 80s and the early 90s under the Clinton administration, where we said you can't use loan guarantees for anything across the green line, right? Use restriction. But built into that legislation, and that was loan guarantees, it wasn't aid, but built into that legislation was an understanding of the concept of fungibility of funding, right? It's meaningless to say you can't spend money here unless you're actually penalized, because otherwise say, fine, we didn't spend your money on this, we spent someone else's money on this. Your money is being spent here. Well, $1 is exactly the same as another. This is the same logic behind the Taylor Force Act, right? It's not enough to say to the Palestinians, we won't let you spend our money to pay Social Security benefits for people who have killed Israelis or who have been killed by Israel or put in jail by them. We're saying not only that, but we're going to actually penalize you the amount that you spend, because otherwise our money is going to be indirectly subsidizing. The problem is that I'm hearing very little readiness to have to deal with the fungibility question. And if the safe place for progressives to land, except for the handful, it's more than a handful, I think 13 signed the AOC letter, but if the majority of progressives are going to say, listen, we're going to get tough and we're going to say that none of this money be spent on annexation, but by the way, we're not going to put any fungibility clause in, so you can just move the money around, it's fine. Or just write us something assuring, okay, well, for every dollar that we give Israel to do X, we free up another dollar to spend on annexation. That's the idea of fungibility. And I didn't get any sense reading Congressman Van Hollen's comments that he certainly wasn't he did not say in any way that he was ready to see some kind of offset like that. That doesn't mean he isn't, but he didn't say he was.
Danny?
Yeah. Well, you don't go out in the streets and people tearing out their hair and gnashing their teeth because we're getting criticism from the EU. But we are arriving at a situation where it is filtering into Israeli public opinion, and it has not yet had major effect, that we are sliding into the pariah status of an apartheid state. Those who read the papers are concerned about the International Criminal Court. The chorus, and there has been a chorus, and I agree with Lara, we haven't seen this backed up by a willingness to engage with deeds, but there has been a very sustained and articulate campaign by most of the EU member states. And finally, I would point out the special role of King Abdullah. Boris Johnson writes an op-ed for Yediot Ahronot, those Europeans are all anti-Semitic. King Abdullah of Jordan is popular, and the peace agreement is a consensus except for the carpet-chewing right, which happens to have a lot of power these days. And Jordan has been adamant, articulate, clear, and they are probably the weakest and most vulnerable player in this whole calculus, but they are pivotal in interpreting these issues to the Arab world and to a certain extent to Europe as well. And I think it is also becoming more apparent, again, not sufficiently, that this will jeopardize one of the greatest strategic assets Israel has, and that's our strategic depth and our border with Jordan and the kind of regime that you have there. And this will be placed in great jeopardy. I think that the role of King Abdullah will be extremely important in the coming days and weeks. The question is whether he is at liberty to engage. Look, on the subject of civil society in Israel, you're putting me in a very difficult position because I'm part of it. And we're on the endangered species list. I mean, I do not for one moment underestimate the importance of the voices like Michal Sfard, Merav Zonshine, breaking the silence, whether it's Avner or Yuda. They give us terms of reference. They give us a way of understanding. And I think that they are being listened to as never before, but we're not players. I don't even, the forces of moderation, I don't even talk about progressive forces. The forces of moderation in Israel have been decimated. We are not represented in the Knesset except marginally. I mean, our great hope, Yair Golan said, the West Bank isn't occupied. You can't occupy your own homeland. Come on, if you can't recognize occupation, you cannot tell us what this is all about. We are doing what we are doing, and we look at what is happening with civil society in the United States, including Black Lives Matter and others, with a degree of envy, because we're pretty much on our own. I don't think we're worthless. I think we're important. But I think that history and circumstances have marginalized us, and we are trying to unmarginalize ourselves. But I think it would be disingenuous for me to pretend otherwise. And by the way, this is not a criticism of my colleagues only, it's a criticism of myself.
Thanks, Danny. So we have quite a few questions here, and I'll start. Maybe I'll lump them, or at least lump them thematically. So there's a couple of questions that have to do with the legal side of things. We've been talking a lot about the political implications, repercussions of annexation, but there's several questions about the legal process and the legal meaning. So maybe I'll ask two questions, and both of you are welcome to chime in. Maybe Danny more so because of your legal credentials. One is, what is required legally in order for annexation to happen? What is the process? And the other question that has to do with a legal issue, and maybe Lara, you want to talk about that a little bit, is what does it actually mean legally for the status of Israeli citizens in the West Bank and Palestinian non-citizens in the West Bank? What would be the difference? What kind of laws would apply to them? What would be the legal status of both Israelis and Palestinians?
Me? All right.
Yeah, you start.
There's a dirty little secret, and that is if Netanyahu wanted to annex all of the West Bank, including Area A and B, he could convene the cabinet this evening, have a 3-sentence governmental order, and it would be annexed. He doesn't need the Knesset, because the same legislation that was enacted on June 27th and June 28th of 1967, whereby we annexed East Jerusalem, is still on the books, and it can be operated in the same way. It's interesting that he hasn't gone that route, and I don't think he will, but it gives you an indication if anybody anticipates there being technical obstacles for annexation, forget it. Piece of cake, I can annex with my eyes folded. Right.
Is that equivalent to an executive order in the United States?
It's the equivalent of an executive order in the United States. It would be two orders, one extending the rule of law of Israel to the areas in the attacked map, and second, perhaps expanding the boundary of the municipality of Jerusalem, which will be the case should they go the route, as Lara had mentioned, of settlement blocks. This legislation will likely be three sentences. That the law and administration of the State of Israel will apply to the map attached as Area A. The government ministries are instructed to have transitional regulations to fully integrate governmental and municipal authorities into Israel within 3 years. It's done, okay? Now, by the way, we didn't even have that in 1967. We have replicated a mirror image of Israeli law in the West Bank so faithfully that it will not be difficult at all. One of the interesting questions that periodically comes up, what about the Palestinians who in the areas who will be annexed, which is a fascinating legal question. It's sometimes posed in a different way. What can we learn about the annexation of the West Bank from the annexation of Jerusalem? And my answer is gar nicht mit gar nicht. Okay,
Nothing.
Very little. Why? We annexed an urban collective that now amounts to 350,000 people. Netanyahu is on record, and I believe him, that this annexation will not entail the annexation of Palestinian residents. He won't achieve that, but he won't fall far short of it. That will be likely achieved in one of three ways. Gerrymandering the border between Area C and areas A and B, so we get rid of built up areas with large numbers of Palestinians. The enclosure of Palestinians living in villages who can't leave their village except by means of a sealed road that leads to Ramallah or Bethlehem. So they're physically in Area C, but not of Area C. And then you will have those in the crosshairs who cannot be gerrymandered and who cannot be enclosed, the Bedouin encampments in Khan al-Ahmar and in Susia. Annexation of the settlements blocks seals the fate of something like Khan al-Ahmar. So we will be left with 10 or 20,000 Palestinians in all of the many hundreds of kilometers that we annex. And they'll say, look, we're going to give them the status of the residents of East Jerusalem. They'll be permanent residents. We'll treat them well. They won't have the right to vote, but they'll have everything else. This will be racially annexation deluxe, will not be an obstacle, and it will be ugly.
Lara?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, and I think Danny covered it really well, but I mean, we're all guessing, right? We don't know exactly what's going to be annexed, how it's going to be annexed. We, of course, don't even know if it will be annexed. My expectation is it will be. In terms of, I think I'm sometimes accused of being someone who sees this, with the worst case scenario. I actually think I'm seeing things with a pretty clear-eyed pragmatism of what's been done and what will be done. And looking at annexation in the West Bank, I think we can learn some things from how Israel has treated Palestinian citizens of Israel in areas where they don't want them, like the Negev. And I think we can learn something from the way they've treated Palestinian residents in Jerusalem, who are a minority that is barely tolerated much of the time and who don't have rights. And if you think about when Netanyahu looks at the map of the West Bank and says, we're going to keep all these areas, even under the Trump plan, you can look at the map that's in the Trump plan, and you can sort of see areas where I think it is almost unquestionable there is going to be some sort of effort to transfer populations. You cannot annex a cohesive area of land without moving a few people. And why should a few people stay in the way? This has always been the Israeli view when it came to the security barrier. You know, a handful of Palestinians suffering is nothing. Of course, moving any Israelis is a trauma, but moving Palestinians, or moving, if you think about in the Negev, where Israel basically has said, we are taking entire villages of Bedouin who are citizens of Israel, and the court has said, yes, it is perfectly legal to relocate them into what are essentially going to be shanty towns so that we can develop the land for the purposes that we want. Why would anyone think that Israel would not employ that sort of logic in developing the West Bank when it annexes it? And I don't think that requires someone to be deeply pessimistic. I'd also add that we've had 53 years now watching Israel's policies, which are policies always predicated on security and rational governance, which have been used to deprive Palestinians in East Jerusalem of their right to remain where they are, whether it is center of life requirements, saying, well, you don't really live here anymore. You have, you know, so if a Palestinian is in an area that is annexed, but they want to keep a Palestinian ID, is their center of life now Ramallah? Or do they have to give up some rights as Palestinians? Do we end up seeing people as a more of a systematic effort to move people based on security? Or do we see the settler type ideas, which we hear from settler leaders, of imposing loyalty oath, kind of that sort of thing, where you say, well, you can stay, but only if you meet these criteria. It moves Palestinians who are already under occupation, living without any guarantee of their rights and any fair arbiter for their rights, to a position of actually not having any rights, as the Jerusalemites are, where if they are permitted to stay, it is by the benevolence of the Israeli government, and they can either accept the terms or not. And the last piece I would add is the absentee property law, which Danny is the expert on. The concern of, if you have land that is annexed and the Palestinians are not annexed with it, Palestinians who own that land, whether you will not see an opportunity to use the absentee property law the way we've seen it used in Israel after 48 and in Jerusalem after 67. And I'd be astonished if it weren't. We already have a situation with the barrier where Palestinians are unable to use their land, to access their land and use it. And under Israeli law, which is based here on Ottoman law, if you can't till your land for a certain amount of time, it's no longer yours. And whoever does till it, if the settlers get hold of it and they plant trees, after a certain number of years, it's automatically theirs because they're using it. It is inconceivable that annexation would not end up with the absentee property law again being used to deprive Palestinians of more land, even if the people aren't included in it.
Good. I mean, not very good, but thanks. We have a couple of questions here that have to do with the role of Arab states. Maybe I'll be more specific with this one, and that is, we have a question regarding the role of Gulf states. Does the displeasure that we've seen coming from people, from leaders in Gulf states, register with both the Trump administration and the Israeli government?
Lara, you go ahead this time.
Sure. I have no idea what registers with this government in terms of displeasure. My sense is that, they're more than happy to have the Gulf make noises. But I mean, the expectation is when it actually happens, much like with the Jerusalem embassy or the Golan or settlement expansion, they'll basically they'll come up with some narrative that justifies not having an impact policies. The real question always is, will they face real pressure from their populations that would mitigate against such a hapless response? And I think the journals of Arab studies are littered with articles explaining how the Arab street will rise up. over Israel-Palestine, much like the journals are littered with articles about how the Wahhabis are the days of the Wahhabis are numbered in Saudi Arabia. I mean, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. Maybe it'll be right at some point, but at this point, I think the folks inside the Trump administration and probably inside the Bibi government are pretty sure that, you know, they've got strong ties, and maybe this will be a temporary setback. But, you know, the UAE just announced the first civilian cooperation with Israel on some medical stuff. So, you know, to the backdrop of impending annexation, they announced that.
I pretty much agree with Lara's analysis. I think from Trump and Netanyahu's perspective, the whole issue of regionalism is to create the minimal optics necessary to give Sunni states cover in order to create the grand alliance against Iran and screw the Palestinians, and most of them would screw the Palestinians without batting an eyelash. That did not play out exactly on the move of the embassy in Jerusalem and recognition, but Jerusalem is a special case, and I'm not sure that it would apply here. So far, the statements have been good. I would highly recommend not taking them at face value. Having said that, I think that one, in spite of everything that Lara has said, with which I agree about take these people seriously and at their word, one of the considerations that I think some people in the administration have, which David Friedman clearly does not, is how can we do the maximum annexation in a way that will abbreviate the time before the Sunni states stop pretending to support the Palestinians and go back to business as usual. And I think that that is a question of, it's not a rift, it's a question of nuance. It is something to which David Friedman is likely tone deaf. I think others may be more attuned to it. Don't rely on that to say, oh, they won't dare jeopardize the Grand Alliance, so annexation is off the table. They will be looking for a way for this minimal optics necessary to give them cover.
Can I ask Danny a question? I'm sorry, this isn't.
Of course.
But Danny, can you talk a little bit about what you and I have both been watching, I know, for the past couple of years, is the question of growing, whether or not Israel welcomes Saudi influence or taking over the Jordanian role on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. I see this coming up in reports almost every week now. And I look at some of it with a grain of salt, but I'm very curious what you think about that.
There is a serious amount of geopolitical jockeying taking place over the Temple Mount. There's a bid for power. The Jordanians have custodianship. That custodianship has been challenged by the Trump plan with Israeli sovereignty and Jewish prayer. But you see a Turkish involvement, you see a Gulf involvement, you see a PA involvement, and you also see Saudi involvement. The Jordanians recently, a few months ago, reestablished their Waqf Council, in which everybody was from East Jerusalem. But there was an Emirati East Jerusalemite, a PA East Jerusalemite, a Gulf East Jerusalemite, no Saudi. There have been leaks to the effect that the United States is contemplating diluting the Jordanian role. My suspicion is that these leaks are not exactly foreign to the Prime Minister. And I've seen clear indications that the Jordanians are very worried. They are really worried. And they're finding, being as in a delicate situation they're very cautious about how they express it, but they are. Ultimately, I don't think that the United States or Israel would dabble with Jordanian custodianship, because this really is the kind of thing that would jeopardize the stability of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and you don't want to play with it. Even the Saudis don't need the fall of a kingdom next door to them. These things transpose easily. I would not rule out the possibility of this happening, and it may already be happening. A subtle message to Jordan: acquiesce to annexation, mute your opposition to annexation, or acquiesce to the dilution of the Jordanian role on the Temple Mount, Ram al-Sharif. And that is a very dangerous threat, and I would take it very seriously.
So we have quite a few questions here, and I guess not that much time. One interesting question that we had addressed in a previous webinar with Khalil Shikaki, the Palestinian pollster, has to do with Palestinian nonviolent action. And the question we have today is, why aren't the Palestinians engaged in that kind of action to try to stop, or at least influence, or at least demonstrate against impending annexation? And the one action that is being mentioned here by the attendee that we have asking the question is a march a la Gandhi, the kind of Gandhi march. Why don't we see that?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, I find the question a little painful, because what it suggests to me is that there's a problem, because when Palestinians do protest nonviolently, it doesn't get covered. There was a significant demonstration against annexation in Jericho last week. I think it was for 2 days. And if you want to know why more people didn't come, it's because Israel controls the roads and stopped buses. And yet they did go there, and it was very peaceful, and it was quite remarkable, and it got no coverage because, the Israeli press, I think it covered in Haaretz and nowhere else. The Israeli press is not interested in stories where Palestinians are doing things like protesting nonviolently. I've seen today there's coverage in the Israeli press and the US Jewish press of the Palestinians' day of rage in Gaza and around the world, which are nonviolent protests. There was something circulating on social media calling out the terrible day of rage of Palestinians, which was essentially a car convoy that was going around to various sites that they saw as pro-Israel. And you can argue about whether you think it's legitimate to protest Israel's actions in front of APAC or in front of the ADL or in front of a Hillel or only in front of the embassy of Israel. But whatever, it is a nonviolent convoy of cars honking horns and waving signs. Doesn't get coverage. Fundamentally, and I hope that APN maybe can get some Palestinian activists to talk about this directly, there is right now enormous activity going on amongst Palestinians, and this includes a younger generation which is struggling against both their own authority and against annexation, occupation, all of that, and trying to figure out the right way to do it. But there is a tremendous amount of nonviolent protest. It's just nobody's interested in covering it.
I'm going to do this very briefly because I don't think it's appropriate for me to judge or second guess Palestinian strategy. I'm their occupier. And we as occupiers have contributed to the fragmentation of Palestinian governance and Palestinian society. As an observer of Palestinian society, and on occasions I'm willing to weigh in, they have so few assets to put in place and are facing so overwhelming odds. I don't think it's for me to judge that. I want to, and on 2 points, one of which echoes Lara's last point. When at 2 o'clock in the morning, there would be a takeover of a house in Silwan or Sheikh Jarrah, the late great Faisal Husseini, leader of the Palestinians, would race over to the scene, and I would race over to the scene, and who would get there first? And I would look visibly upset, which I was, and Faisal would comfort me and say, you Israelis are creating facts on the ground. We, the Palestinians, are the facts. And that is an immutable truth, and it's not only a numerical truth. I want to echo what Lara just said from something completely out of the ballpark. Figures up to mid-June on the epidemic. There were 4,000 cases in Jerusalem, overwhelmingly from the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. There were 180 cases in East Jerusalem. Now, the common wisdom is that ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods were vulnerable because they're impoverished, overcrowded, communal, and they hate the government. Move 2 kilometers to the east and you will find Palestinian neighborhoods that are impoverished, overcrowded, communal, and hate the government. And they imposed a discipline. There has emerged an ad hoc leadership in East Jerusalem among young men and women, which is astounding. The common wisdom is that the ability of a country, a state, to deal with this pandemic depends on the credibility of its governance. Compare Trump to Merkel or Macron to Johnson. The Palestinians don't have governance. They don't have a mayor. They don't have a prime minister. And yet they have generated an enormously impressive political leadership. I will end with an anecdote which I find chilling. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Zoom session of Palestinian activists who were coordinating the response to the virus, imposing discipline, working with the clinics, working with the hospitals, and out of nowhere, somebody entered the room and said, I'm Captain George or something like that. You are violating Israeli law by carrying out PA activities, especially you there over there from the PFLP, and then left the room. But 53 years of our occupying has generated a very credible leadership, and they're not going away and they will not be held back. So I by no means would judge them harshly.
Thanks, Danny. I'll end with one interesting question that's just being asked, kind of maybe Talmudic a little bit, and that is, would it be advisable for advocates of the two-state solution in the United States to be advocating for equal rights of Palestinians in the annexed areas once annexation actually happens? Would that impede advancing the goal of a two-state solution?
Lara?
So quickly, and I want to make a quick point before that, which I meant to make when I spoke earlier about the Jordan Valley. I want to just remind people, if they're asking why Palestinians are not more up in arms and in the streets opposing annexation, hypothetical annexation is for Palestinians on the ground who already live under complete and total occupation for generations. The threat of annexation, if you talk to people, is like, okay, fine, you're just going to double down on where you already are. So the idea that people would be out fighting against annexation, no, if they're fighting against anything, they're fighting against occupation, apartheid, annexation, all of it. And I think it's really important. There's a lot of really smart stuff being written by Palestinians trying desperately to explain this to people, because there seems to be the sense among a lot of well-intentioned progressives that if we can just stop annexation, things will be okay. And it's outrageous. It really is, because the situation today for Palestinians is effectively apartheid. It is effectively living without control over your rights or over your life, without rights, all that. So, annexation will definitely make that worse in some ways, but it's more about clarifying how bad things are. That's what annexation does. They're already terrible. And in terms of what to push for after, assuming annexation happens afterwards, look, I think this is a huge problem for all of us as analysts, for me as activists, because the real question is going to be, what do Palestinians want? There's something extremely patronizing about deciding on the behalf of the Palestinians what is the best thing to ask for. already, I will say that much of the analyst and activist community on Israel-Palestine, one state, two state, whatever, has said, none of these solutions are on the table. All we can talk about is rights. Whether those rights are achieved in one state or two states is irrelevant. We have to talk about rights. And I imagine post-annexation, that's going to continue to be the frame. But right now there's also a moment, and again, I encourage you to get some Palestinians to come and talk about this. Palestinians are having a discussion with themselves about what their national aspirations are, what they're, as a people, what they're organizing around. Now that we are seeing the paradigm, which they accepted grudgingly, because it was a massive compromise, to come to Oslo, which is we're fine with only this tiny portion of historic Palestine, right? So if that's been taken off the table, what are they fighting for? And the question is, are you fighting, when you're fighting for rights, are you really fighting because you support the rights of Palestinians, in which case you should take your cues from them? Or are you fighting because you want to come up with an Israel which you feel like you can defend regardless of whether that's actually respecting what the Palestinians who are now, if they're annexed, want?
Go ahead, Danny.
A daunting question. Obviously, the question of one state, two states is very important. It's under current circumstances, I think, largely irrelevant because none of it is available. I agree with Lara, it is not for us to strategize, but as an Israeli observer, I would say that the common denominator of Palestinian resistance in all shapes and forms is end occupation and mitigate apartheid. And I think that that will be the way forward. There was a specific question: would I encourage people to insist on equal rights in the newly annexed areas? I would do so only as an Israeli advisor, not a Palestinian, who has observed Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem for the last 30 years. And that is, there were periods in the past where occupation was a disease in remission, Teddy Kolik. It is metastasizing. And occupation has doubled down in East Jerusalem. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem are significantly further away from anything approaching equal rights than they were under Teddy Kolik, 35 years ago. So I think that any pretense that Palestinians who would be in these annexed areas, and I think that they will be small in number, will achieve more than the Palestinians, this national collective, which is powerful, it's got elites, it's got structures, will achieve more than the Palestinians of East Jerusalem, I think is very problematic, if not delusional. And I would advise, there are all sorts of things that but don't expect to effectively move towards equal rights. Ain't gonna happen.
So we are 4 minutes after 1 o'clock. We are way we've now exceeded the 1 hour that we've budgeted for this discussion. If the two of you have quick closing remarks that you'd like to make, go ahead and do it now. Danny, Lara.
I have one thing.
Please do. Yeah.
And that is, I'm hearing a lot from good people. Israel has already annexed Area C, de facto annexation. Lara and I can do a doctorate on de facto annexation. And I agree, I understand what people are saying, I get it. But there's an implication sometimes unintentionally in that statement, that de jure annexation doesn't matter. It does. I'm not sure we're going to succeed. I don't know whether we're going to fail. I know that annexation, formal annexation, will make things worse, and stopping annexation is worth the effort. I understand the despair. I see annexation, occupation, and apartheid, and I see no end in sight, and probably no end in sight in my lifetime. But this is not the time to walk away. There's no walking away. So as daunting as the challenges are, we have to keep at it.
And I actually will just very briefly add, because this is something that didn't come up earlier, for folks who are looking at this thinking, where is the safe place for me? How far can I go in opposing? I want people to really pay attention to the other currents that are going on in parallel to the current towards annexation, which is most importantly to me right now, the effort to conflate criticism of Israel and activism of Israel with anti-Semitism and with support for terror. I would point you to the article in the Jerusalem Post today, which is making the case that German MPs who came out against annexation are basically supporting anti-Semitism and terror. I would point you to the headline in the Free Beacon, which is now circulating from yesterday or the day before, saying that Ocasio-Cortez's letter suggesting that it is illegitimate because it is supported by groups that support BDS and therefore it is tainted by support for terror. This is the path we're going down. And if we're not going to stand up for international law, for freedom of speech, for free political speech, whether you like it or not, which includes the right to boycott, whether you do it or not, we are going down a very, very scary path where even if Israel ends up where Danny says, heading towards pariah status, in parallel, we have efforts around the world to make it illegal discrimination, hate speech, to actually challenge Israel's policy. And that's happening in the US as well. You gotta figure out where you stand on values and stand firm because it's going to get harder.
Thank you very much, Lara and Danny. I'd like to thank you particularly for this closing tone and closing message of our webinar that activism today is more important than ever. I want to thank all of the people who joined us, quite a few, to wish those who are celebrating here in the United States a happy 4th of July. And we are ending our webinar here. Thanks again, Danny, and thanks, Lara, for joining us. Goodbye.